But welcome to this, our fourth virtual seminar in our Researching Youth series. It's been a collaboration, this endeavour between BERA, the British Educational Research Association Special Interest Group for Youth Studies, between the BSA, the British Sociological Association's Youth Study Group, and the PSA, the Political Studies Association Young People's Politics Specialty Group. So today's event, as you can see, we are unpacking and looking at some three fantastic examples of placemaking, exploring spaces and places with young people. So just to highlight what we've got coming up as well, so we're fourth in our series, we're at the halfway point. So next up we have the PGR and ECR, the Adaptability, Resilience and Career Transitions. That's the 7th of June, one not to be missed. And then following that one, our next one is Embodiment and the Digital World on the 14th of June, which we hope you may be able to join us for to see the whole list. And I think, Krenza, if you're happy to just post the link to our next one in the chat. But if you go to the BERA website and under their events section, you'll be able to see the kind of breakdown of each. Back to today. Just to highlight, as I said, collaboration today between ourselves, BSA Youth Study Group, BERA, PSA, very much supporting this cross-disciplinary dialogue in youth studies. We've unpacked, and some of the other themes have been around creative methods, co-production. Today's is around that placemaking, but please do join us for the other sessions. They come together to form what we hope is this fantastic picture of the contemporary kind of research and practice that's been done within kind of youth studies and around young people. Today's running order, we have myself and Hannah King here kicking us off, and then we've got Julianne taking over and Rachel and Peter. So Muddy Methods is up first, myself and Hannah, Entanglements of Field Research. Next, and then we've got a short Q&A, followed by Situating Belonging at University, the Value of Walking Interview Methods with Julianne. And then again, a short Q&A, and then finally the contributions and challenges of co-producing research with young people, postcards from a coastal town, and that's Rachel and Pippa seeing us off, and then we'll kind of have that concluding remarks. So no breakout rooms today, just three fantastic papers for everyone. So we hope that you find these presentations thought-provoking in terms of your own research and processes. We'd love, feedback particularly, and I'll pop it in the chat in a minute, but we're using hashtag @BERANews and hashtag #BERA_youth studies today if you want to tweet at all. At the end of the session, there'll also be a feedback form that's sent out that would really appreciate you kind of giving us your thoughts and feelings about how the session went today. Finally, please do, if you pop your Zoom screens into gallery mode, you'll be able to see everybody at once. The chat's going to be in use, so do click on the chat function. Please do keep yourselves muted just until those that you kind of invited to or of that Q&A session, just because background noise can be a bit disrupting for the speakers. And make all use of the raise hand if you can for that speaker to ask a question. Fantastic. So perfectly on time. You're going to see me stop share and then start sharing again. And again. And it's into our first speaker, which happens to be myself and Hannah. So welcome. So I'm Dr. Evelyn Buck Matthews. I'm based at BCU, Birmingham City University.
Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Hannah King, based up at Durham University.
Fantastic.
Evelyn, are we going to get a 5-minute warning at the end? Oh, I'm setting a timer and down by my screen. Yes, thanks, Krenza.
Fantastic. Yep. So as our presentation today is going to be looking at muddy methods, entanglements of field research.
Thanks, Evie. So what I'll do is I'll just kick us off and give us a little bit of a context to the research and the methods that we're going to be talking about. So we're literally talking about and situating this within UK music festivals, which are a fairly novel and very under-researched arena or area, but it's an enormous industry. So one of the recent select committees reports during COVID found that there were almost 1,000 music festivals taking place in the UK across any typical year, with a value of about £2 billion to the economy and about 7 million customers. So these are really big events when you add them all together in terms of their contribution and their role within the UK. And they're really diverse, from jazz to opera to street carnivals. But what we're talking about are music festivals in the UK. And by that, we mean events that are ticketed, greenfield, they might be day only or multi-day with camping and with open air music. And I'm just going to kick us off with thinking a bit about some of the perceptions of and contradictions about festivals. So in terms of young people, their core appeal to young adult customers is very much around selling images of liminality, temporary freedom and time out from everyday life that Eve's going to talk a little bit more about. And this has very much led music festivals to be associated with crime, deviance and transgression, at least to the wider public. So to the onlooker, transgressive festival behaviours can range from increased drinking, drunkenness, drug use, nudity, through to antisocial behaviour and violence, but also at the same time seen as countercultural rebellion or resistance, a carnivalesque inversion of social norms, and an ethos of peace, love, unity and respect. And what we see, Hayward argues that transgressive leisure and carnivalesque pleasure offers an opportunity for escapism for young people, not just from boredom, but from the insecurities of everyday life, which we see certainly applies to young people in these transitions. But the extent to which festivals are genuinely radical and countercultural is questionable, given the commodification of transgression and the intense control of contemporary festivals. So Fiona Measham, in her English festival study that she leads, looks at the way that festivals represent carnivalesque realms that merge opportunities for transgressive pleasure with elements of risk, danger and subversion. And within this context, they found that consumed with a sense of ambivalent well-being, their participants' perceptions of risk were distorted, leading to changed behaviour, most notably patterns of increased alcohol and drug use that were atypical of their consumption in everyday life. So within this context, how do we undertake meaningful and ethical research with young people? Are we researching within Instagrammable brand fests or wild zones? So I'll hand over to Eve.
Fantastic, thank you, Hannah. A word, a minute on kind of festival theory, really because to pick up on some of those kind of practical, this big money making industry. Also, there's the sociologist in me. There is very much a unique and interesting social phenomena around festivals, to which are potentially a bit dated and a bit fringe, but which I like to draw on to conceptualize some of the sociological interactions, is temporal autonomous zones and communitas or liminal theory. So TAZ, temporal autonomous zones, it was coined by Hakim Bey in the 90s, anarchic poetry. So not the easiest to read, digest, but it's a radical manifesto which looks at, it refers to this practice of eluding kind of formal power structures in alternative spaces. It's purposely undefined, which, for the academics in this is a scary kind of concept, but it's purposely left undefined because of the nature of its kind of being. It's the experience of, or these temporal autonomous zones are defined or boundaried by experiences of excess, intensity, abundance. So hopefully you can kind of see the ways in which festivals and the experiential and the sensory kind of play into this idea of temporal autonomous zones. It's a zone of peak experience, sensory intensity, perfect kind of tactic in an era. So it also brings in the political, a perfect tactic in an era of omnipresent and all-powerful kind of control, and yet simultaneously riddled with cracks and vacancies. So it's a space for kind of small politics and also for potential. So hopefully, like I say, throwing in a little bit sociological in there to encapsulate these liminal temporal spaces and the potentials they have to interrupt method as well as kind of grow method. Communitas draws on Turner's kind of ideas of liminality and very much just the difference or the alternative communities that are created, how social bonds experienced through kind of shared understandings. We're going to talk about, shared understandings of the weather, of mud, of landscape, actually how this goes towards creating this, to conclude, a very unique social laboratory. So we've discussed the kind of current picture, but let's look at what myself and Hannah have kind of unpacked. And just as a caveat for both of us, this was 2019, pre-COVID, a picture of festivals before the world kind of changed. So very much looking forward to the unique knowledge that this summer will bring. But these are what we kind of undertook in our own research at music festivals. So over to you, Hannah.
So just thinking about some of the methods that we've both used, we've very much drawn upon ethnographic methods, thinking about observations, ethnographic interviews on site. We've also both been involved variously in undertaking surveys on site, which I'm sure you can imagine, pieces of paper in a muddy festival, but also tablets in a muddy festival with no electricity, start to pose real and unusual and very particular challenges to undertaking ethnography literally within a field. We've also been involved in interviews, for example, with festival goers and with those who are involved in the organisation and running of the festival. And just a quick note here about gender when we're thinking about festivals and research that we do with young people at festivals. So feminist scholars from leisure studies, geography, criminology, sociology have explored women's unequal access to leisure spaces and opportunities that are very much enforced by patriarchal structures and gendered risks. And festival spaces are also gendered and subject to those same patriarchal structures and gendered risks. And historically, research on festivals is pretty sparse, and it's mostly focused on transgression, hedonism, and intoxication. So there's a really important role for researchers when we're thinking about researching gender and people's gendered experiences of festivals, including when we think about the potential of festivals to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. And I'll hand back to you, Eve.
Thank you. So yeah, a note on my method. What you can see, your left, I'm terrible, your right-hand side is a series of maps. So I started out with paper questionnaires, and that was wholly my kind of pilot year, was around getting as many kind of questions as I could at festivals to explore the emergent kind of themes, but very quickly young people, and to be explicit, it was young people only that I was looking at in my doctoral work, which you'll see there. And very much on the questionnaires, young people were doodling. They were spending longer. They were even, they were filling the space and then going onto the back, which was blank, and then doodling or writing more. So I got an insight. Actually, they wanted something more than the language, than the kind of performer of a questionnaire. So the again, sociologist with the geography in me drew out, or what I did, and this is Glastonbury at the top there, was a print out the kind of festival map that you get given as a punter, as a attendee, and got young people to initially kind of map out the spaces they were walking, their favorite areas, to elicit what areas within the festival really what had meaning and belonging to them. And as you can see, that was quickly kind of subverted again with doodles, with drawings. I don't have it here, but someone actually wrote me on a bloodstock map, I think, a full trilogy of the wars between the different campsites. So again, young people were subverting the kind of methods that I'd gone in with, these paper methods. So I didn't give up, but in my kind of desire to capture, I gave them a blank piece of paper, and these are some of the things that they kind of drew. So we've got my only prompt was draw me your perfect festival. Glitter was used, some fantastic kind of, as you can see, kind of creative methods. As a caveat, I am no way creative. I gave them a blank piece of paper and offered them up a range of kind of utilities to use, but and as we'll kind of talk about later on, the ability to capture in spaces where young people have these strong senses of belonging, community. So this is how the kind of emergent process of my paper methods. Hannah's kind of said, you know, the e-tech and the use of kind of Padlets and things falls apart with things like the weather, you know, paper definitely, but e-technology around kind of Wi-Fi signal, as well as battery life. At the bottom there, you've got one example of me many years ago, many moons ago. I think it was 2014 Glastonbury. But just again, I use kind of ethnography and particularly kind of autoethnographic methods alongside to capture. And this is one group of young people that kind of I did walkarounds with and really kind of absorbed me in. So challenges in the field, we've kind of already started to or indicate some of the challenges that we faced. So in terms of the kind of ethnographic, very much so ethnographic and our contemporary understandings, our literature out there in terms of guidance and support for ethnographic methods very much aren't those that are involved with liminal spaces. So this is one thing that me and Hannah have both reflected on, actually the limitations of time to the range of discourse that we have around ethnography really doesn't take into account, you know, we've got not rules, but we've got kind of discourses around how long you should be embedded somewhere and the kind of rapport as well as relationships. But this, again, festivals, whether you're working with stakeholders that may plan for 8 months or you're in the field for maybe a week or 2 weeks. So we don't have a range of kind of ethnographic unpacking to support people who are looking at kind of ethnography in liminal spaces. The limitations of time mean that those rapports and those trust that we may be able to build in other places we aren't able to, or it's built in different ways. Another kind of challenge we encountered was this trickiness of traditional methods. So whether that's kind of the noise around kind of trying to interview someone or trying to do some of those traditional in terms of paper surveys or focus groups, things like noise, movement, and the kinetic elements to festivals really bring the challenges to those traditional methods. So having to employ alternative becomes quite important. Covert and overt, I mentioned before, and that kind of picture of me with my participants, but also at times because a festival is so temporal. Have we got our 5-minute warning? Oh yeah. Some difficult kind of challenges that are popping up, particularly around the environment and the weather. So to conclude, I'll hand back to Hannah if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem. I'm just going to add a couple of last little few things around the challenges that we have had to navigate in terms of tensions and challenges. So lots of those have been around ethics. For example, how do you go about getting informed consent for people who are under the influence of drugs and alcohol? At what time in the festival can you do research? How do you ensure anonymity and confidentiality if you're doing an interview whilst walking along with a member of staff? In terms of positionality, are we insiders or outsiders? How do you undertake research if you're backstage within the crew area, for example, in what is a highly masculinized security and police presence? How do you build trust with people? How do you respond to disclosures and ensure your own safety if you're there as a single solo researcher within that space? So in terms of conclusions, what we just really wanted to conclude, Eve and I are both huge festival fans and huge advocates for undertaking research at festivals with young people. They provide a real potential to disrupt what we think about methods and how we use them. There's a potential there for different relationships with our stakeholders and participants. It just means that we have to work with those contradictory spaces. For example, where we see drug taking, hedonistic free behaviours within a space that is highly subverted, but also highly controlled, for example, through surveillance via cameras and drones. So we see high regulation, but also high subversion. And there's also huge potential for impact from research at festivals. Because they are temporal spaces, there's a real potential to influence how they are designed, how they're planned, how they operate, the culture and ethos that is embedded within them, right through from things like harm reduction through front and back of house drug testing, through to opportunities for temporal design to create less gendered risks. I'm going to hand back to Eve for a final comment.
Sorry, I managed to mute myself. So yes, a complex space of mess and contradictions. We love it, and I think the capacity it has to build new method. It takes away our own power as researchers because of all the things we've talked about. But in doing so, that allows for others, particularly our participants, to lead us in new and exciting ways. Thank you very much.
That's lovely. Thanks, guys. So I'm just going to start my video. So thank you. Did very well on the timing. So we've got 8 minutes exactly for questions. So if anyone would like to use your hand, I think is the way that we're doing it, with your reactions. And then you can obviously come off onto your mic and ask questions, or if you'd rather not, and you can put your question in the chat instead, then that would be great. So I'm just going to give everyone a couple of seconds to get your thoughts together. So Gio, I can see I'm in gallery view, but cannot see any hands.
I might just bombarded everybody with such a whisper. Everybody just now wants to be in a festival.
Yeah, exactly. We're all thinking about that festival space. Actually, I, if it's okay, I'll start off the questions. So I was thinking about the different spaces at festivals, and you know, guys, how obsessed I am with kind of spaces and times of drug taking in particular. So I wondered, when you were doing your research, if you felt different in different spaces. You mentioned like front stage and backstage, but I was also thinking about the borders of festivals, and then also the kind of camping area as well. And I know that's been a particular concern around sexual violence. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we certainly found in the different festivals we've been to, that it really varies according to festivals, and quite often there's a really important and kind of delicate role to play as a researcher working with the festival management teams, but there's a whole range of different agencies on site who spend months, if not a year, planning for the festival, but then are all suddenly thrown together for a very small moment of time. So the way that relationships happen is very different, and then to go and insert yourself in there as a researcher can be kind of quite challenging to navigate that. And what we found is, certainly with the sexual violence research, that there are spaces that women in particular feel less safe, particularly areas where they're darker, where they're more likely to be on their own, for example, on their way to and from campsite areas. But then there are also the way that people interact with that space. So the behaviour of men, or particularly men in groups, or men who are drunk, has an impact, but also so does how women feel about potentially feeling safer, dependent on their own levels of intoxication. But one of the things that we've found very much with festival staff is the festivals that have very open community-focused ethoses may not necessarily be the ones who are actually the most open to more progressive approaches to, for example, drug testing or sexual violence services on site. And some of those that some people might be able to imagine have much more negative reputations and images in terms of issues around young people and incidents around sexual violence, around rapes, around deaths even, might actually be, in some cases, have been much more open to more progressive ideas for allowing the research to inform kind of harm reduction mechanisms. So it often doesn't necessarily go with what you think it's going to, which makes it even more challenging then as a researcher within that space.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Hannah. So yeah, different kinds of festivals, which is what you said. I mean, there's 700 festivals, so the range is amazing, isn't it? I've got a question from hi Cassie. Let's have a look. So Cassie says, did you use any methods that allow people to reflect on the significance of their experience after the festival had finished? I like that. So reflecting back on their experiences.
Oh, I've kind of popped in my answer there. The answer.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
some of them I got them to do their maps. Some of the imagined maps that I've got is outside, but I very much, so those 3 cohorts of, similar to the picture you saw, that I went into 4 years worth of summers, but I also did kind of interviewing outside of festivals completely and got them to reflect. What did I find? Some interesting kind of emergent things around the space and its meaning within versus the space and its meaning kind of outside. So the imagined, especially around certain areas, so that the green spaces as well as particular music venues. And then there's this sense of temporal identity that transgresses the festival. So for instance, identities around Boomtown, identities around people having the subcultural capital around and the sense of identity well outside of the festival gates. They still see themselves as those kind of young people were very much still seeing themselves as that kind of having that identity. I could talk for a long time.
Thanks, Eve. I can see Janina, you've had your, thanks Cassie. Janina, you've had your hand up for a while. Thanks, Janina.
Hey, thanks for your presentation. It was really interesting. I was wondering, and I think Eve, you kind of addressed it already a little bit, what kind of questions you asked to find out about the concept of belonging that they felt. And I was wondering if you think this can somehow be translated to other spaces, like schools, for example, like, I don't know if that makes sense. Thanks.
Oh, in my first series, and I did the questionnaires, and I did keep on with the questionnaires, even though I kind of, I very much asked around, I tried to have things emergent, but ranking, so things like community and so getting young people to rank, once given some kind of, are you here for the music? And actually the overall was the people came out as the overarching, what is it around festivals that makes you, what is the most important bit about festivals? And music was kind of third on the list to the people in the community. And I think those kind of temporal, especially if we take it into kind of a school setting, it's really kind of inquiring of or being directed from those emergent kind of themes. And definitely something that can be translated beyond, because there's elements of the school classroom that is liminal, that is temporal, that is that this kind of work can definitely, is not our focus does, and that was the very brief conclusion around, to take some of these ideas of that unique high impact space can go into other kind of spaces and places, definitely. Hannah.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on Fiona's question in the chat about ethics. And I think sometimes it's very much the ethical dilemmas that we have in any research with young people, but then some real kind of added nuances. So, for example, issues around informed consent. Anybody who's researching in the nighttime economy or leisure spaces with drugs and alcohol will come across this, but it's how you make decisions about whether somebody is capable of giving informed consent, you're making a judgment on the spot about whether how drunk or how many drugs they've taken, for example, before you do that. Or in the case of sexual violence, the sexual violence research, to be really careful about what we would be asking people, because being in a festival it might be a space for some people that they use in a cathartic way, but it isn't an obvious space. It isn't a traditional or standard space that you would use to support somebody if they make a disclosure. Again, one of the ethical challenges around disclosures is you're there as a researcher, but I guess you're almost responding in the way that I'm guessing you did, Fiona, working in a festival welfare tent. There are issues as well around trust and insider-outsider status. I remember at one festival we wore our Durham University department t-shirts because we didn't want to look like we were just regular festival goers, but we also didn't want to look like we were part of, in like high-vis jackets or part of security. But because they said criminology and a Martin Luther King quote on the back, we were asked by management to take them off in case we were intimidating festival goers, because it had the word criminology. So even when you're trying to position yourself, whether you're covert or overt, it can be really, really tricky. And if you are there for a whole weekend, for example, how do you, if you're there as a lone researcher on your own, that idea of like checking in with somebody in terms of as a lone researcher often isn't practical. You're only going to have a limited amount of battery for a whole weekend. Are you going to go and enjoy some of the festival yourself? And do you then become recognised as a researcher? At what point are you the researcher and at what point aren't you? Which is a challenge within any ethnographic research, but then within the nuances of a festival space becomes those kind of added dimensions to try and navigate, really.
Fantastic, thanks, Hannah. Right, so lots to think about there. Interesting issues around ethics as ever when alcohol and drugs are involved. So thanks, guys. So next we have Julianne. Hi, Julianne. I don't know if you want to, hi there, share your slides. And Julianne, excuse me, is going to be talking another kind of space to university space, talking about situating belonging at university, and Julianne's going to talk about the walk-in interview method. Thanks, Julianne.
Just pulling up my slides here, so bear with me. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. My name is Julianne Viola, and I am a postdoctoral research associate at the Center for Higher Education Research and Scholarship at Imperial College London. At Imperial, the learning and teaching strategy is an institutional policy that's been operationalized through targeted research on student sense of belonging, which I have been leading since 2019. So today I'm going to be focusing on some of our methods that we've used in the Belonging, Engagement, and Community Study. This is also known as the BEC project, so I'll be referring to it as BEC throughout. And this study has been conducted at Imperial across all faculties and course levels. We've utilized mixed methods approaches, including walking interviews, which I'll be discussing today, to collect data from approximately 700 Imperial students. These methods include open and closed questionnaire responses, traditional semi-structured interviews, and walking interviews to examine student sense of belonging. We also conduct follow-up interviews with interested participants after they have completed their course at Imperial. And today, as I mentioned, I'll be reflecting on the walking interviews and the unique insights that we've gained from this method related to placemaking and belonging among university students. I'll begin with an introduction to the method, and then I'll move on to discuss a walking interview protocol for the BEC study and some of the findings that we've learned from the walking interviews. So since late 2019, when we began the study, we have conducted a total of 42 interviews with students, and 5 of them have been walking interviews. We were able to do this until March 2020, when the world changed significantly due to the height of the COVID pandemic. So place-based interviews embody a sensing of place and reveal how people and places interact. Place-based interviews, like walking interviews, have the potential to unpack experiential understandings of these places. And this is something that we're very interested in exploring with our sense of belonging research. The influence of place on the research encounter encourages participants to be critical of their interpretations of the spaces they inhabit. So the nature of the walking interview, also referred to as a docent interview or a walk around, in other sociological contexts, positions the participant as the leader of the interview. This person will take the interviewer to places and spaces important in their daily experience. And there are a few ways that walking interviews can occur. One is through using fixed routes to record a participant's first impression of a place, or by allowing the participant to move freely about the location and kind of guide the interview. At Imperial, we chose this second option for the Beck study, where participants were able to take us through their everyday journeys to places on campus that were meaningful to them. And there are several important features of the walking interview. Importantly, this type of interview allows for an organic flow of conversation, which is often led by the participant and might make walking interviews a bit less awkward than regular face-to-face interviews where you might be sitting on chairs or in a closed room someplace. The reversal of the traditional interviewer and interviewee roles might give the participant a greater sense of agency and ownership over their experience that they're sharing through the interview. This is particularly important for research with young people, to allow young people to have a greater sense of agency and independence in both the interview and their everyday life experience. In walking interviews, the physical space can elicit memories and allow the participant to describe the place and their experience of that place. Participants might also feel more confident and comfortable in the interview because they're familiar with the space in which it occurs. Importantly, different places have different meanings and power relations associated with them, and it's therefore important for the researcher to take an active role in interpreting the actions of the participant and their surroundings. Issues of power as they relate to space are also important to consider. Coming back to the Beck study, we understand that the concept of belonging is, for the most part, undefined and quite complex. Scholars Baumeister and Leary reviewed over 300 empirical studies within social and personality psychology, sociology, and anthropology, and they concluded that belonging is a human need, and belonging can be experienced even without having things in common with a group. In the education context, Goodno's definition of belonging is often applied as students' sense of being accepted, valued, included, and encouraged by others in the academic classroom setting, and feeling oneself to be an important part of the life and activity of the class. More than simple perceived liking or warmth, it also involves support and respect for personal autonomy and for the student as an individual. In the Beck study, our aim is to understand how Imperial students conceptualize belonging and the factors that influence their belonging at university. While there's been a limited focus on place and belonging at university, place is key to shaping belonging in ways of being at university. Similarly, the idea of community as both interpersonal relationships and commonality can include social space, which is often created and maintained by people who have the necessity or desire to have a safe shared space. In designing our study, we looked to Holton and Riley's study at Portsmouth, wherein walking interviews were utilized as an approach to helping better comprehend students' experiences and understandings of university towns and cities. With the understood benefits of walking interviews that I mentioned just before, we opted to include walking interviews as part of our mixed methods approach to the Beck study. In our project, students guide the researcher around meaningful places within and surrounding their campus. The surroundings act as prompts both for the researcher and the participant to discuss belonging. We began the study in 2019, as I mentioned before, a few months before the COVID-19 pandemic, and so we've only completed 5 walking interviews to date. We've completed semi-structured interviews through Microsoft Teams, and that's also how we completed our follow-up interviews. But we're hopeful that we can continue the walking interview method in coming academic years, as it's a method of in-person interviews that we can still minimize COVID risk by maintaining social distancing. So here, I'm going to share with you our walking interview protocol. Since at least some of the interview took place on the student's campus, we included several provisions pertaining to the privacy and confidentiality of other students or people the participant knew whilst walking around campus. At the start, we asked participants to lead the walk and provide some ideas of where they might guide us, including places they go or have gone very often or at regular intervals, places that they go at particular times, such as meeting with friends or for social or study purposes, spending time alone, and also maybe before, between, or after their classes. Also, places that they have particularly memorable experiences of, and places that relate to their interests and aspirations. We also include some guidance on where we might not be able to go. For example, some spaces where it might not be appropriate for a researcher to enter, such as halls of residence. We also note to participants that if we run into someone they know during the interview, then the researcher will explain the research with them so that that new person can decide whether or not they want to partake, or also if they'd like the researcher to stop audio recording the interview. Some of the prompts we used are here. Can you tell me why this place came to mind? How often do you come here? Do you have any particularly vivid or lasting memories of being here? Can you tell me about any specific examples or memories? How do you think this place would make you feel if you were to revisit it years after you leave Imperial? We also included additional prompts from the semi-structured interview protocol as well, just to ground this in our study about belonging. For example, what does it mean for you to feel at home? What is important to you for creating a sense of belonging? Think about the places you call home or communities you feel part of. Can you tell me about any involvement you have with these communities? And what do you see as the most important issues facing these communities? With the spaces that are important to the participant as the focal point of the interview, we developed a more nuanced understanding of the situations and spaces that foster belonging among university students. I'll share a few examples. One undergraduate chemistry student took me through their department's main building on campus. We passed through the chemistry cafe, pictured here, and then to a series of tutorial rooms. The participant and I sat in their tutorial room where they explained that this space is important for their learning as well as their socializing. They shared, I spend a lot of time in the chemistry cafe and then come to this room. When it isn't used for tutorials, we can just go in and work. When I'm with my friends, we typically eat lunch in one of these free rooms. As we sat in that tutorial room, I recall my own educational experiences, wherein I would spend my free periods in various art studios as a place where I felt safe and welcomed. This leads me to my next example, where a student led the researcher, my colleague, over to the central library. There, the participant explained their experience with mental ill health and how a member of the library cafe staff offered comfort and support when this student needed it the most. I'll read the quote aloud. The central library is amazing. There were times when I was drained. I was crying, calling my mother and saying, Mommy, this is not working for me. And I actually tried to book a counseling service and they made me wait for 4 weeks. I obviously never attended because I was okay by then, but it's pointless. In that time, the library staff were really helpful. There's this person, a staff member, he sat here and asked me, what's wrong? Tell me. And he chatted with me and I was okay by the end of it. So all of this helps with the whole community spirit. And I know there's actually someone who will help me. Through our analysis of the past several years of data from the Beck study, we now understand that feeling valued is a central tenet to students belonging at Imperial. Having a setting wherein students can interact with staff outside of the traditional teacher-student setting can aid in students feeling valued by staff and contribute to their sense of belonging. From my own experience as a researcher utilizing this method, I experienced the advantages that I highlighted from the literature earlier in this talk. In particular, the way that walking interviews allow the participant to be the leader of the interview. I found that while I have fortunately in the past never had issues with any rapport building, the walking interview itself lent itself really well to building rapport between myself and the participant. It's a more casual setting that allows for a more natural flow of conversation. While we're still in the nascent stages of utilizing this method in our research due to the pandemic, we aim to bring this method back in the next round of data collection commencing this autumn. It'll be a great opportunity to conduct follow-up interviews with students who we had initially interviewed at the height of the pandemic, to capture the reflections of both experiences. Additionally, with the increased prevalence of hybrid and blended learning at Imperial and other higher education institutions, we're particularly interested to learn more about the particular spaces that students are drawn to upon their return to campus for the face-to-face university experience. This method will become particularly useful for us to research this inquiry further, to capture not only the effects of space on student belonging, but to understand how to best approach to maximize the on-campus space to improve the student experience. So that's all from me today. But before I take questions, I just want to thank you all so much, and many thanks to the PSA, BSA, and Vera for hosting this phenomenal series and inviting me to take part. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the Learning and Teaching Strategy at Imperial College for funding this research. And I would also like to thank my colleague Eliel Cohen for his collaboration on the BEC project and for moving our project forward with the walking interview method. And I'd also like to thank Professor Martin Kingsbury and the rest of the team for their support at chairs. So thank you so much, and I look forward to taking questions now.
Fantastic. Thanks, Julianne. That was really interesting thinking. I was just looking at the picture you had at the end there, and with the nice autumn leaves, and I'm just thinking, I hope you can wrap up if you're going to go for some walks in the autumn. So I'm guessing weather is something that might influence your experiences of this. Okay, so we have a question. So we're going to dive straight into the questions. Obviously, want to make the most of the time. So hi, Ellen. So the first question we have for you, Julianne, is from Ellen. And Ellen asks, were you able to differentiate between local and international students in their experience of belonging? It's a great question.
Yes, so we have done this. I didn't include it in this talk because our number of walking interviews is so small for now. However, given that we have had roughly 700 participants through the questionnaires, we can start breaking down this data and understand sort of which groups are experiencing a greater sense of belonging versus others. And we are finding that overall international students tend to have a slightly lower sense of belonging than home students. And this could be for a variety of reasons. Including, being far from home. Oftentimes in interviews, it will come out that for international students, they tend to gravitate towards students who are also from their home country or a similar region in the world, where they feel like they have, similar cultural understandings as well. So I hope that answers your question. We're definitely going to be continuing this research for at least one more academic year, hopefully further, depending on the funding situation, but we'll definitely be getting more information soon.
Thanks very much, Julianne. Unmute myself. Just having a look. So anyone like to ask Julianne a question or pop anything on the chat? So Fiona says Moodle. Very cryptic, Fiona. Do you wanna elaborate? So no, that's okay, Fiona. So I've got a question, and I think then Janina's got a question as well for you, Julianne. So I was really interested, wondering if when you were doing the walk-in interviews, any of your respondents talked about the spaces online that they might have felt, at home or had a sense of belonging to, that were maybe linked to their university experience. I wondered if there was any kind of movement between the sort of physical space they were in and the online kind of communities they might be part of.
So that is a very good question. Given that we conducted the walking interviews just before the pandemic started, this was certainly before most of the hybrid and blended learning was also kind of kicking off and taking place. But this is something that we're aiming to investigate further this coming academic year, when learning continues to be in a more blended setting and students have presence both online and also on campus and physical spaces. And we'll be getting a sense of sort of what those physical spaces are that are important to them as they gravitate back to campus, but also whether they feel a sense of belonging online in the sort of comparison. But I can share that over the last couple of years in the semi-structured interviews that we've had online with students via Microsoft Teams, Some have been able to find, a sense of community online. Typically, it's students who are in their later years of university and they already have an established friend group that they can continue chatting with, or playing online games with, etc. But for students who, at least last year, so that would have been the start of the second year of COVID, who had their first year at university in that same year where there was still lockdowns and uncertainty, it was very difficult for them to establish a greater, it's hard to say, any sense of belonging, but they found it difficult to get to know their cohort. Rather, when people are, we can see now, I know it's for the purposes of this seminar series, but everyone's cameras are off. So for students who don't ever see their peers or even their lecturer face to face, it's really difficult, especially when, cameras are off, and it's really difficult to establish a community. It can be quite isolating for many students. So that's what we found so far, but I think in the coming next year and hopefully years to follow, we'll find much more information about, what is it about particular online spaces that might be helpful for creating sense of belonging. For example, a particular team on Microsoft Teams, or maybe an informal social setting.
Lovely, thank you, Julianne. So I think you had a comment from your collaborators. So online forums did come up in the study before the pandemic, but not specifically in the walk-in interviews. So thank you for that. And I wanted to bring Janina in here, just Gina had her hand up. Hi, Janina.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. It's such an interesting method. And I was wondering whether you collected any data on, or asked the participants about whether those who felt a high sense of belonging, whether they engaged more in activities at the uni, like were they more likely to be class rep, like for a course, or engage in some sort of activities?
That's a great question. So that's something that's certainly come through in our interviews, where we've learned that students who are participating, quite regularly in clubs and societies at Imperial tend to speak more positively. We don't, in the interview, we don't necessarily ask them to, rate their sense of belonging or complete the questionnaire at the interview. That's something they can do separately. So we tend to analyze the data separately. But they often talk very positively about those experiences and finding a group that they belong to and feel like a family and like home, etc. When they're involved in communities like that. Related to your question in terms of leadership roles that might be taken, like various representatives, either as academic rep or taking on a leadership role within a club or society. Again, students tend to talk very warmly and fondly and positively about those experiences and about the people that they are working with. So I think there's certainly a correlation there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julianne. So we have another great question from Amy. Hi, Amy. So Amy asks, was there any difference when looking at students who are on courses with less contact time on campus less frequently? I was thinking about that because you showed the science, and I was thinking, oh, I've got friends that did science degrees and they definitely had more hours than us sociologists, so on campus and in labs. So I wondered if there was a difference there.
That's a great question. So through the walking interviews, as I mentioned, we haven't conducted those during the sort of last two COVID heavy years. So this is something that we'll be investigating in the next year. But from what we do understand from the questionnaire data that we have, in year 2, so that was 2020 to 2021, we began asking a question in the questionnaire related to how many hours of time students tend to spend on campus for various academic activities like lectures, laboratories, meetings, etc. And there's only a very weak positive correlation between that time spent on campus and their sense of belonging. But there's so much else going on that can influence someone's sense of belonging. So I think this will be really interesting to examine further through the walking interviews in the future, because there's really not much that can be explained completely by the questionnaire, because correlation does not equal causation. So it does provide very interesting questions for us to examine in the future.
Thank you, Juliana. So I think we have literally like 30 seconds for Eve is asking about longitudinal. And it sounds like that's kind of what you're doing anyway, Julianne, doesn't it?
Yep. Yeah, so we began the study in 2019, and each year we conduct a questionnaire and interviews between November and February, so sort of the winter months. And students who are in their final year, so for example, students who are in their final year now or were in their final year, a few years ago, they'll be interviewed right before that, so sort of late summer. So we do kind of have a longitudinal relationship with some of the participants. Anyone who says they would like to be contacted are always contacted, but whether or not we actually are able to manage a follow-up interview is another question, which I'm sure many of you can relate to. But having this data, just capturing moments in time between each of these recent academic years has been really helpful for us as an institution, understanding what the importance is of being on campus. Is hybrid learning here to stay? Probably. And also something that I mentioned before about there being a very weak positive correlation between time spent on campus and sense of belonging. This is important for us to know, because perhaps this sort of the blend is actually quite important, having both the experience to be more autonomous and empowered in your own learning in terms of deciding to come to a lecture in person versus online, having other interactions on campus. It's kind of puts the onus on the student and what they might feel is more important to them. So it's really helpful for us to know as an institution and how we're planning curriculum for the years to come. So I'll leave it there, but thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Julianne. That's it's a really interesting, another really interesting talk. So next up we have Rachel. I think I can see Rachel. Excuse me. And so Rachel is going to be talking, I love this title, Postcards from a Coastal Town. And this is about the contributions and challenges of co-producing research with young people. Having grown up in Southend-on-Sea, I'm very excited about this coastal town focus. So thank you. Thanks for that, Rachel.
Thank you. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can hear you okay, yeah.
Okay, great. And can you see the slide okay?
And I am going to...
Not quite yet.
Not quite yet, I think it
Is it still loading?
Yeah, probably. You've got share screen on.
Yes. So yeah. Can you see the whole slide?
No, from my...
Okay, I'll try again.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Off and back on again, that'll do it. If it works this time. And I'm presenting with Pippa.
That's it.
Okay. Yes, hi Pippa. I'm sorry, I'm so rude. And Pippa as well. So fire away. Thank you.
I'll introduce myself anyway. So hi everybody. My name's Pippa. I'm Pippa Curtin. I work for North East Lincolnshire Council as the Youth Voice and Influence Coordinator. So ensuring we gather the voices and use the voices of children and young people in our service development, not only in the local authority, but across our partners too.
And I'm Rachel Venture-Kroon, and I'm an early career researcher at UCL.
So myself and Rachel from UCL have been working together with some of 5 of our young people from a variety of different youth voice groups or social action groups locally. We've been researching the experiences of growing up in a coastal town. So North East Lincolnshire, for those of you that don't know yet, it incorporates Cleethorpes, which is actually on the estuary, but is classed as a coastal community. And we have quite a broad spectrum of industry around the sea. So today we wanted to share our reflections on the contributions and also the challenges of co-producing research with young people as young researchers, and what we've learned so far in that process.
Sorry, to unmute myself. First of all, we'd like to give you some context on the research. Existing research shows that the characteristics of coastal towns shape young people's life chances. So, for example, in the UK, at least, a lot of coastal towns have experienced economic decline in the past few decades, with higher than average levels of unemployment. A lot of the work available is either part-time or seasonal or both. Quite often there's a lack of transport connections, and that affects access to higher education opportunities. And also there are quite often lower than average health outcomes, and that was highlighted in a recent report. So that was sort of the starting point really of wanting to do this research.
Yeah, so working with the young people, the things that we wanted to find out was what is it about our coastal towns that impacts on our young people that are growing up? So all of their things like aspirations and how those are shaped by their experiences of growing up there. Quite often a coastal community is seen as being the end of the line. And yeah, so how does that shape any of their aspirations? Do they want to stay? Do they want to move on? And so then we also wanted to look at what are the things that we'd like to do? What are the solutions that we could find for making our communities better for young people for the future?
So the 2021 project that we did was part of a wider mixed methods project led by Avril Keating. And it was building on an earlier collaboration between UCL and Young Advisors, a national organisation, and North East Lincolnshire Youth Action. So in our project in 2021, we recruited 5 members of Youth Action. Well, that was thanks to Pippa and her role. We recruited them to become young researchers on the project. So we started by running training workshops, and we developed a series of participatory methods to use in the interviews. So that was something that we did together, although probably more initiated by UCL at that stage of the project. But the young people had a lot of input into refining those methods and helping us to think about how whether they would be effective or not. The young researchers then recruited participants, which included young people of their age, as well as some older participants. And they then arranged to interview those people. They recorded the interviews, and then we at UCL transcribed the recordings and analysed the data. We then got funding to develop it into a sort of follow-up project, which is where we are now. And I'll just try and move us onto the next screen here. So we were very fortunate to receive funding from UCL Grand Challenges to do this current project, building on what we've done in 2021. So really this time we were wanting to develop the intergenerational perspective on growing up in coastal towns, and to really try and explore what it's like growing up in a coastal town and how that might have changed over time. So by having more of a focus on interviewing as many older people as younger people, we felt that would give us more of a sense about how those experiences might have changed, particularly comparing the experiences of older people who perhaps were teenagers in the area back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, when the area was thriving economically, and it was a major fishing port, and there were plenty of well-paid jobs available. So so in terms of how we did the research, Pippa will talk about that in just a moment, but our guiding sort of research questions were these. So what do young people and what do older people who've grown up in a coastal town see as the challenges for young people of growing up in a coastal town, and how might these have changed over time? What opportunities and solutions do people feel could help young people overcome these challenges? And then a sort of broader question about how working with young researchers can create opportunities for discussion, for conversation between people of different generations, and a way in which we can develop shared understandings of the current situation and the future of coastal towns. And so for us, what we're really thinking about now and what we want to share with you today is what are some of the ways that working with young researchers can contribute to research, but also what are some of the challenges of doing collaborative research in this way, and how can we address those. Sorry, I think did I go on too much there?
No, that's all right. Yeah, so this time we were able to start the collaboration much earlier, and we learned such a lot from the previous time that we worked with the young people, and most of that has been incorporated into this. So the co-production kind of started as we were working through the first project, and then has continued on. So those young people are able to see how some of their comments and experiences have shaped what we're doing now, and will continue to shape the project. So what we're going to do today is just share some of those ideas about what were the really great contributions included in that, and also what were the challenges that we've faced so far, and some of the solutions of how we've overcome them.
Thank you. So for us, one of the key the fundamental things really about making really collaborative research work is to build those trusting relationships, and that takes time. So what was important then was that we did have prior experience in working in this way. So Pippa, obviously in her role of working with the young people and the particular style of working, and I had some previous experience of working with young researchers in a different field. And having worked on the previous project, as Pippa said, that was a really good starting point for us with this particular project, because we were continuously reflecting on what was going well and what we could do differently this time. So one of the key things for us was to take more time this time around, because we felt it was important for the young researchers' involvement to be meaningful for them and to be more effective in terms of the project. It was really necessary to give ourselves more time to do that. It was really important that we came to the project with shared values, and I don't think that was ever a problem for us, but we did recognise that it was important for us to keep talking and to keep reflecting. So Pippa and myself, and with the young researchers and with the academics at UCL that we're working with, and also with partners more widely. So through that sort of ongoing reflection, we were able to develop a really strong understanding of what the aims of the project are, our reasons for taking this approach in terms of co-production, and so the values around that, as well as the young people's role and responsibilities as young researchers. So for that, it was necessary to really take the time to identify what were the young people's motivation for taking part. We felt it was really important to take that as our starting point. So we've had discussions with the young researchers. We've also asked them to complete a survey where we give them the space to identify or to tell us what they want to get out of it, what has brought them to the project. And also to help them to start thinking about some other ways that they might benefit, sort of suggesting to them some possible skills and kinds of knowledge that they might gain from taking part. And also for us to reflect as UCL and Youth Action and Young Advisors, what are we hoping to learn from the young researchers? We very much are seeing this as a mutual learning process.
So moving on from that and building on that, it was around one of the things that we found and we find in any kind of youth voice work is it's really important to create safe spaces where people feel comfortable to be able to express how they feel, what their experiences are themselves, and be able to provide us with high challenge and along with high support. And that comes from all angles. So we want our young people to feel safe, to be able to challenge us and say, but that's not working. I don't really enjoy that. I don't think that would work really well. And these are the reasons why. And they would then bring that. So it's about everybody bringing their strengths to the table and learning from each other. And it is that continuous learning process from each other. And needs to be that on an equal footing rather than going into that relationship with a sense of this is how we're going to do something because we know better than you do. It's about experiencing that together and learning together from all those different perspectives. And the young people come from a variety of different backgrounds too. So they bring all of those different experiences with them to help with that challenge, and learning those skills is brilliant for adult life as well for them, and learning from them is brilliant for us. So it's all about doing with, not to. So if you think about the social capital window, it's that kind of making sure that we're actually working together and we're continually challenging ourselves and challenging each other. And that provides us with a deep learning environment where we can speak about things and learn from each other. There's always, every time I work with young people, I find something new. And it was about building those positive relationships that are ongoing and memorable. So we've created training and support on a one-to-one level for the young people as well as a group, and they'll support each other. They provide that for each other as well as getting that from us, and they provide that support for us as well. In their own way. So involvement of the young researchers as early as possible was really important. So it's about that kind of learning from last time and starting before we even get together to say, this is what we heard last time. Is that still the case? How do we work from that? And giving the time to be able to do it this time. And then balancing between openness and flexibility, but also having some structure and clear aims. If we're going with a blank sheet, it's often people don't know where to start. If you go in with something or some options, we can then explore those different options and see which feels right for the different situations that we're in. Ensuring we've got a clear plan and enough time to deliver it, and recognising the financial reward, however that may be. So different projects do it in different ways, but it's about making sure that we recognise young people, that just because they're young doesn't mean they should do everything for free. Is that if they're co-producing and working with us in a professional way that we would pay another person to come in and do with us, then we should recognise that in one way. So that we do that with under 16s of those on benefits. We can do that through a voucher system. It can be through financial payment as in employing young people, or it could be, we've done this with groups of young people where they're younger, where you they are awarded, so they give their time voluntarily, but they're awarded a pot of money to do some social action work with as a result of the project. So but it's really important recognising the financial reward.
So just to say that in terms of developing this current project, because the young people have been involved at an earlier stage in terms of designing the project, we've been able to really develop the methods. So this time, one of the things we're doing is about, well, we're doing focus groups, we're doing interviews, we're organising it in a different way, in a way that will hopefully be more productive and more supportive as well. And there's another method that we're incorporating this time, which is new, is walking methods, so linking into the previous presentation there. So we're really excited about that. We haven't started the field work yet, but it'll be starting next week. So yeah, we're looking forward to really engaging in those creative methods. In terms of making the research a really positive experience for the young researchers, and an opportunity, it's really important to identify possible barriers to the participation. So some of the things that we've been thinking about quite a lot are, first of all, the fact that the young people often have a range of other commitments in their lives, whether that's in education, other paid work, volunteering, and so on, sometimes a combination of those. So in terms of the organisation of all the stages of the research, we are doing what we can to make sure that there are real opportunities for the young people to take part, regardless of the work around their other commitments. Transport, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of being quite a common issue in coastal towns, and particularly for young people, that is something that needs thinking about. So where we are organising, for example, focus groups in different community venues, we are making sure that the young people, that they are able to access those places, and if they need support from us, that we're providing that. Illness and sort of more general health needs is obviously something that we need to think about, particularly with COVID. That can sometimes, but also mental health needs as well as physical health. These are things we need to think very carefully about. Sometimes it can be an obstacle for young people that want to take part as a researcher. So we are doing our best to provide support and to find ways of involving young people that want to take part, where these things might come up. And it's also about having a plan B, because where a young person may have wanted to take part, and then obviously with no prior warning they find that they're not able to, then it's about us making sure that we're still able to do the field work in that instance. Thinking about particular learning needs that different young people might have. For us, I think what's really crucial there is that PIPA already has sort of long-standing relationships with the young researchers. So there's that understanding of what individual needs might be, and how we can best support the young people, but also having ongoing conversations with them and encouraging them to share with us, let us know how we can best support them. An awareness of possible tensions between individuals that may be an issue at times, or between local organisations where you're bringing different stakeholders together in a room, that there may well be some issues there. So it's about being aware of possible tensions and doing our best to address those sensitively, so that everybody can take part and feel comfortable. And another issue is that where young people are being paid for their work, that can actually have quite it can affect, if a young person is on benefits, or if a young person is under 16, they wouldn't have a national insurance number. So these are the kind of things that we have come up against previously. So it's a consideration, and it's not a reason not to pay young people, but it does mean that we have to think sometimes creatively about how we can make sure young people are financially rewarded without causing them unintended consequences in other areas of their life.
Okay, so in terms of talking about facilitating young researchers' meaningful participation, it's really important that we make sure that their experience is really positive, and that then that's transferred to new young people that might get involved in the future, and how those young people that we've worked with now might then pass on some of those skills to others. And we're already talking about some of that now, but so addressing the identified barriers, some of those that we've talked about, some more I'm sure we'll come up against as we go through the different scenarios and so on. But being realistic with plans and expectations, like Rachel spoke about those things about education, and thinking about now is the middle of exam time for year 11 and year 13, and so putting lots of work in place for them now. We've planned all our work around that, so we know that we've got some young people that aren't in exams at the moment, so they're picking up the weight of the project for now, the activity for now, and then at the end of the exams others will pick that up too. Listening to them and showing them and explaining to them, and it sounds like a simple thing, doesn't it, but quite often if young people don't receive feedback and understand what difference they've made, they then don't believe that they've made a difference even though they have. So it's really important about making sure that we listen to them, but also that they understand and feel heard, and that they know that their input is valued, and that we take their ideas on board, but explain why we can't do things if we can't, or look for an alternative option. Regular support and reflection was so important, and giving that as a one-to-one and as a group, and encouraging them to support each other too. being creative and open to change. Young people always come up with new ideas or throw spanners in the works and sort of say, what about this? And you might never have thought about it. And that's the wonderful thing about it. But, you know, being open to change and being creative about things. And then this is something that young people always challenge me about, and we always challenge adults that they're working with about, is making it fun, interactive, and thinking about how would I experience that as a young person? What would make me want to get involved in that? And listening to them about what interests them. And sharing and thinking about that, not just in the work that we do directly with young people, but also in how we share those findings, how we do the analysis. So it's throughout that whole process of involving them from the start, doing the research and analysing the findings and then sharing those findings with others. The more interactive and fun we make it, hopefully the more memorable it'll be. And we just got one final slide.
Yeah, so we just wanted to finish by thinking about the impact of a successful co-produced research project. So yeah, Pippa, did you?
So benefits to young people is around that developing new skills, knowledge, experience, stuff to put on their CV. It's really important to stand out from the crowd in a really competitive work market, but not only for work, but for applications to further and higher education for them, increasing their social networks and their confidence through the work we do, and shaping their own aspirations for themselves, because they learn lots. We learn lots from them. They learn lots about their own area and maybe how they feel about the area through doing research like this.
Learning about co-production as an approach. So we are constantly reflecting on our practice. We're constantly talking about what we're doing and what we're wanting to achieve. So that, as I say, Pippa, myself and the young researchers and the people we're working with more widely. So I think this continued reflection is really important in improving what we're doing now, but also helping to shape what we achieve in the future. And also through sharing our learning, like through opportunities like this, hopefully that's you know, a good way of sharing good practice much more widely and in other fields too.
And then rich, in-depth qualitative data. It is to address our research questions. The ways that we've looked at doing this not only gives it hopefully an interesting way of taking part in the research, but also gives us some really rich storytelling type research that we can gather and we can learn from. And especially when we're thinking about experiences of growing up somewhere, they're the sort of things that will be really amazing and useful for us to help understand how it was then, what are the similarities and differences, and how it is now, so that we can plan for the future and really give some background to why we're making the suggestions we are for the future.
And in turn, that will enable us to influence policy and practice. So we really want to, as Pippa said, share our findings as a really important part of the project. We want to share our findings locally with local decision makers and with practitioners, and also more perhaps at a regional level and national level ultimately. But also sharing findings can change young people's views of their town and potentially also change, help shape their aspirations for themselves and for their local area.
And then finally, just development of new partnerships has already been happening massively through this project, and it's opening lots of doors locally, but also nationally. And the partnership of North East Lincolnshire with University College London on this came via a national network, so which is Young Advisors, and we're a part of that national network. So it's about that kind of the development of all these new partnerships that we're involved in and that want to get involved in the work that we're doing. It's just generated such a lot of enthusiasm and interest already, and we hope it will for the future. So thank you for listening, everybody.
Fantastic, thank you, Pippa. And so you guys got some links there.
Yeah, some links. Yeah, about our organisations, and yeah, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Okay, so thank you. We've got a minute or so for questions, and I think there's already some in the chat, so I'm going to go with those questions. So really fascinating talk, Rachel, Pippa. We had a question from Eve first about the types of analysis that your young participants engaged with. So that's an interesting question, and I guess I'll kind of join the questions up yeah, similar question actually, data analysis as well as planning and data collection. So yeah, a couple of questions about analysis there.
I think we need to distinguish between the 2021 project and the current project. So in the 2021 project, the analysis from the involvement of the young researchers in the process was a little bit limited. It was more kind of, and it's ongoing actually. It's been largely me so far, but in terms of like the careful reading of the transcripts and starting to code and so on. However, as I said, it's not finished, it's ongoing, and around all throughout the process, we've been having reflective discussions as part of our workshops with the young researchers. So we have had some discussions about that as we've gone along. In terms of the current iteration of the project, we're still at an early stage of that. We haven't actually started the field work yet, but we certainly do intend this time to make sure that the whole team is fully involved in the analysis stage. So, and also, as Pippa mentioned, we've built in more time this time around for more reflection. Every time we carry out a focus group and interviews and the walking interviews and so on, we have built in time after those for a reflection together as a group on, you know, the data. So this time around, we're definitely going to be making a more a stronger effort to include everybody in the analysis, but this is something that we also need to explore. So if anybody has got experience of involving young researchers in the analysis of a piece of research, we'd be really keen to hear from you.
Fantastic, thanks Rachel. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, isn't it, about trying to incorporate, and I think that's the hardest part. And maybe also dealing with stakeholders and young people's relationships with those as well. So fantastic, thank you so much. So thanks to all our speakers. We've got a couple of minutes now, so Eve is going to do one of her fantastic roundups. No pressure, Eve. So thanks again, everyone. And also don't forget, we've got, if you're a PGR, then we have the event. The next event is aimed specifically at PGR. So I will hand over to Eve to do a summary of what we've talked about today. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. On a bit of a selfish note, just on that note on analysis, what I've done in the past is ranking and colour. So if you have, in terms of you doing some thematic, but then colouring paragraphs, getting them to rearrange and rank and bringing them in that way. So quick caveat on that one. Yes, roundup, I've been, the geographer in me has been kind of buzzing away there. I think, you know, all of our papers, I feel, particularly the landscape, we recognize that the landscape is influencing our practice as well as the young people that are in those spaces, and I just felt very much of a similar ilk and like-mindedness in the virtual space today, that all of our kind of papers drew that in. I'm very excited that even though we're working outside that kind of recognition of the spatial, walking those spaces and with. So walking and doing with this participatory is going hand in hand with the landscape, which is going hand in hand with our practice. So that was my kind of, 20-second kind of roundup, but it's been an absolute pleasure to hear from Julianne, Pippa, Rachel. Hannah had to jump away, but for me to get any excuse to talk about festivals. And I hope that our work can intersect in ways in the future. Again, I'm thinking walking, as we can have, we can continue these conversations, and placemaking. But I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. Please do join us for the next one and the next one after that. We've got 4 more left.
4 more left. Can you believe we're halfway? Everyone, thanks Francis, and thanks for all the speakers, and we will see you soon in the next event. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.